Hi, everyone. So at this point, I want to talk briefly about what ethics are, which is probably the most foundational question we can have in the course. And for that, I'm going to give a definition. I think now we've read enough to be better able to grasp what ethics is. So ethics is the study of moral standards and how they affect conduct. That is, how they affect what you do in the world. It's a process of inquiry. Sometimes people conflate or they just talk about ethics as if it's synonymous with a code of conduct. And so that's another way that we can kind of understand ethics. For this course, our official definition, and it's because it offers so much information, is going to be that ethics refers to actions a person takes to reach inner agreement through the faculty of thinking about how to live in the world with others. All this means is that human beings act in the world in a particular way. They think about how one ought to act in the world, that for as far as we know, this is something that's sort of central to the human experience. And what ethics is it's an attempt to bring those two types of experience into agreement with each other so that we don't experience cognitive dissonance, which is to say that we don't act like hypocrites and we don't sort of secretly curse ourselves for acting in ways that we believe deep down are the wrong way to act. Okay, as you probably know, we're going to be discussing first and foremost a type of ethics called normative ethics. And the word normative is not used in everyday speech a whole lot, but as a sociologist, I can tell you that normative is related to the word norms, and norms are these informal rules of action that we do, such as holding a door open for somebody. That would be a norm that we have in one society. I used to live in Hong Kong. You may not know this, but the Hong Kongers have a slightly different take on that norm, and they don't hold it open for quite as long. So when I first moved to Hong Kong, I spent the first several months walking into doors because they were always shutting in my face, and I was taking for granted in my mind, based on the norms here in North America, that they would hold the door open for me a little bit longer, but they didn't. What's important for us is that there's two types of normative ethics. Broadly speaking, there is ethical relativism and there is ethical absolutism. And ethical relativism describes an approach to ethics which posits that ethics change across temporal and geographic space. That is, that there is no such thing as an inherent, inalienable, naturally given ethics that exists somehow outside of our cultures, that they've been here forever, and that it's the job of our rational thinking to somehow find them and unearth them, that doesn't exist. Ethical relativism suggests that ethics vary by time and place, country to country, culture to culture. What's ethical in one culture may not be ethical in another culture. Taken to the extreme, this perspective may be used to justify just about any type of conduct. Anything that might be absolutely abhorrent, if somebody says and can somehow show that there's a history within that society of this type of behavior, it can get passed off as ethical. And so it's kind of been associated with this idea that anything goes. To some extent, this perspective relies also on the dubious premise that societies are isolated from each other. And so what I'm pointing out here is that in the context of globalization, where societies, most societies, if not all societies, frankly, have some contact with each other, the idea that one ethical system has absolutely no relevance to another ethical system is a little bit hard to take, because the fact is that if societies have been interacting with each other for a long time, that is to say that they've also shared ideas. And if they've shared ideas, you can conclude that they've also shared a worldview. And so if we are in fact a globe, as a global community that is sharing a worldview with one another, even though there are variations from place to place, isn't it fair to say that we should also share in the ethical system to some extent? And so that would be a weakness, I think, of ethical relativism. Now, if we think about the weaknesses of ethical absolutism, I would say this: taken to the extreme, this perspective may be used to justify the imposition of one society's ethics on another society's ethics. And what I mean here is that any society that thinks that they have the key to what the right ethics are, and that then they think that those ethics are absolute, they're not just true for their society, they're true for all societies, that is a formula for imperialism and colonialism and all of the horrors that are associated with that. Because whatever your ethical system is, to walk into a foreign place and impose it on them, absolutely, even though that society didn't emerge under the same conditions that your society did, that starts to look a lot like colonialism, and there's been a lot of violence associated with colonialism and a lot of, putting it mildly, unfair treatment. And so that's a weakness, I would say, of ethical absolutism, or it's at least something we need to keep in mind. The other weakness of ethical absolutism is this idea that there could possibly be some kind of a true ethics that exists whether or not that particular society decides collectively that it exists, that perhaps God makes it exist. And so even if human beings are unaware of it, God holds these as ethical principles. And so we would still be bound by them. As a sociologist, I'm partial to the idea that ethics, like all cultural ideas that are shared between the people of a culture, they emerged with the culture. They are from us. We are the authors of that. To sharpen our understanding of ethics even more, I want to do an exercise of contrasting ethics with the legal system, because people sometimes conflate law as ethical and ethics as legal, and the two are not necessarily always the same thing. There was a meme on Facebook, I think, recently that I came across, which says, if you're using law to guide your behavior in the world, then you're going to get in trouble, because just remember, slavery was legal in the United States. And so that probably makes the point pretty well. But something that's ethical but not legal, an example of that would be refusing to torture a terrorist suspect, even though it's legal to do so. Now, they may call it enhanced interrogation, and there's all sorts of justifications that I've put forward as to why enhanced interrogation is not the same as torture. But a lot of people agree that it is torture, at least some parts of the enhanced interrogation is torture. And so an ethical compass would guide you not to engage in enhanced interrogation, but legally you would be covered in some circumstances in engaging in some of those tactics. To help understand what ethics are, I want to just make one further distinction, and that is the distinction between ethics and morality. For all intents and purposes, we tend to use ethics as interchangeable with morality, okay? But strictly speaking, they're not exactly the same thing. And the degree in which they're different may be shades of gray as opposed to absolutely different. But I think it's important to pause here to sharpen our understanding of ethics by contrasting it a bit with morality. So just the description of ethics describes what ought to be in the world. It's, again, that attempt to find inner agreement with what I think in a rational way and how I act. And that is what ought to be. That's me saying to myself, in order to find inner agreement, that such type of behavior ought to be the way I behave. Morality, by contrast, describes what is. And what that means is that different people from different societies are raised with an inner compass of how to behave, what's right to do, what's wrong to do. We feel guilty when we lie, not because we were born with some sort of a neural connection that tells us to feel guilty every time we don't tell the truth. We feel guilty to lie because our parents kind of raised that, and through hundreds, if not thousands, of interactions with those parents, we've been kind of socialized with the feeling of guilt every time we lie because somewhere deep we know it's wrong. And so morality is really referring to that socialized part of us that's deep down and is somewhat unique to our families and maybe even our societies. Ethics is that more formal, and that's the key word here, it's a more formalized type of thinking to bring that inner agreement about how I ought to act in the world. And if ethics is formal, you can think of morality as informal, which is to say that morality isn't written down anywhere. Morality is learned deeply, so deeply that it guards, so deeply that it guides how we behave in the world, and we're not even sure that it's in operation at all. We don't feel guided because we've internalized it. And then, as you've been reading about, there are these two main perspectives in ethics that I think are really important for us to understand, and they can kind of form the foundation for how we proceed in this course. And hopefully you're becoming more fluent in both of these ethical perspectives. And the first is deontology. And deontology is, for lack of a better expression, it's a perspective that is against consequentialism, which I'll be talking about in just a minute. So deontology does not put forward necessarily this idea that ethics exist independent of human societies that create them. But it does suggest that there is an ethical system that can be found through reasoning, that sometimes the right thing to do is just the right thing to do, irrespective of the consequences or irrespective of whether it's popular. The contrast with deontology is, as I've alluded to, consequentialism. And consequentialism is a theory that there are no natural rights or nothing to be found through reasoning, but the only law, if you want to call it a law, that we should be attentive to in what counts as ethical behavior is the law of benefits and harms, basically. And that is that we should weigh benefits and harms, or we should always weigh the consequences, the pain and the pleasure. And if the pleasure is higher than the pain, if the benefits are higher than the harms, then we should do the action. If the reverse is true, that would be unethical. A slightly different way of thinking about that is if the most people their lives can be improved, if the most people can be made happy with the action, and the fewest people can be made unhappy, then it becomes an ethical action. For our purposes, I want to draw attention to two different contexts of ethics. The first context is suitable for thinking about situations where a person is in charge of other people and they're drafting policy and codes for an entire organization. So you could think perhaps a police chief. And in this context, you can think ethics is going to work a little bit differently, because what's happening here is you're in drafting policies that you're going to have time to deliberate. And you're going to have time to think through the consequences of one code of ethics versus another code of ethics. And that's one context in which ethical questions kind of arise. But the other context, the second context, is that which we confront on a daily basis in the moment. And so there's less deliberation, there's more of muscle memory involved. We don't have time to think so much, so we have to kind of rely on the habits that we've honed and the thinking that we've done well in advance of those moments that require us to make ethical decisions.